Warm greetings and welcome to CNSS podcast. I am your host Balasubramanian, Head of Strategic Studies Program at the Center for National Security Studies. Today, we are in a conversation with Ms. Annie Pforzheimer, a former career diplomat with over 3 decades of experience in diplomacy with the US Department of State. We dive into the complex geopolitical dynamics shaping Afghanistan following the US withdrawal in August 2021. The power vacuum left behind has intensified regional competition, with Russia, China, Iran, and Pakistan vying for influence while the Taliban governs amidst the international isolation, including donor fatigue and inconsistent international accountability efforts. Join me as I unpack these intricate issues and their implications for Afghanistan and the larger region. Today, we are with Ms. Annie Pforzheimer, a former career diplomat with the US Department of State. She was acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Afghanistan and Deputy Chief of Mission in Kabul, one of the largest US embassies in the world. Her 30-year illustrious diplomatic career focused on security, rule of law, and human rights policy, and included working in the National Security Council on Central American migration. A warm welcome and thank you for joining, ma'am.
Thank you for having me.
Let me start with my first question, the US exit. How do you think has the US withdrawal from Afghanistan created a regional power vacuum, and what are the implications for international isolation and the Taliban's governance?
Well, I think, first and foremost, I'll say that I was one of many US former officials, or probably people who were in the government, who advised against the withdrawal in 2021. And I even would say that starting earlier than that, there were many people who advised against the US policy of negotiating only with the Taliban and ignoring the rest of the Afghanistan political environment. So the power vacuum, unfortunately, was one of the outcomes that we all assumed would happen, and it did. So when the Taliban was given essentially a free hand to take over, they had already begun a process of murdering civil society leaders and creating havoc with Afghanistan's infrastructure. But the military and the government, obviously, as you all know, the government refused to continue the fight, and the military had no option but to stop fighting. And many of its very brave soldiers who had been killed and wounded, etc. These are martyrs who were unable to stop the Taliban onslaught. So the power vacuum, in a way, was something the U.S. had created, but there has always been a tension over Afghanistan, obviously dating back many decades, really set off by the Russian invasion in 1979. And now what exists is something that the rest of the region is trying to understand. Is the Taliban a governing force, or are they an occupying force? That's one question. What do we make of the fact that they have given shelter to many terrorist groups who are, and do not even really deny giving shelter to terrorist groups who are a threat to the countries of the region? And what does it mean to have a group of people who do not consider themselves answerable to their own citizens, but only to God? And what kind of rule, for example, rule of law? I really have to question what kind of international investments or international treaties can be entered into with a group of people who don't think of themselves as being governed by any laws or rules. So the vacuum that was created is that Afghanistan doesn't have a government. It's a large country, 40 million people, It is going through abject humanitarian crisis. Terrorist groups live inside its borders, and there are natural resources that it controls, such as water, which its neighbors want. Other natural resources which are being trafficked, such as minerals and drugs. So all of that is kind of an elements of a failed or collapsed state that exists in a very populated area surrounded by countries that have nuclear weapons. And I guess that's the power vacuum that many of us thought the US should try to avoid creating.
Speaking of being surrounded by countries, how do you think have the recent shift in regional security architecture, particularly Russia's recent diplomatic recognition of the Taliban government in Kabul, have influenced the geopolitical dynamics and the power balance in Afghanistan? And what do you think are the impact for the broader Eurasian region?
The Russian recognition is an incredibly important pivot. It has not been immediately followed by kind of a domino falling effect of other countries. But I think all of us watching this space expect that to happen. There are countries in Central Asia, for example, who follow the Russian lead of delisting the Taliban, which is a bit of a precondition to recognition. It is interesting to me, though, that there's still so much skepticism about the Taliban that countries are not rushing to recognize, and there's still, for example, the CSTO organization is meeting, but they're meeting to reinforce the border of Tajikistan with Afghanistan. They're not meeting to try and figure out ways to introduce Afghanistan into the collective security architecture. They're trying to isolate it. The geography of Afghanistan has definitely worked against it. And it can work for Afghanistan too. There can be ways that it's seen as integral to the economic development of the region. But when it comes to security, the fact is that it is sort of possible to essentially bottle up the Afghan people, to bottle up some of the terrorist groups that come in and out of the country. And from the point of view of Central Asia, they don't see all that much benefit to a more open border, to a more cooperative relationship with the Taliban. I think they're moving themselves towards basically neutrality. And right now, the geopolitical dynamics and power balance in Afghanistan, as I say, it's kind of moving to neutral, that they're not against the Taliban in some kind of active way. We have to see what will happen, for example, with Tajikistan being the host of the National Resistance Front. Will they continue to allow that group to live in Dushanbe? Will they continue to allow some Afghan refugees to stay and be slightly, is sort of slight animosity against the Taliban? Or are they moving to neutral, which I think is happening? But the idea of there being kind of a positive outgrowth of Russia's recognition, again, I think the Taliban have to prove to their neighbors that they are, in fact, responsible players. At this point, all they're doing is hosting groups that pose a threat. And they themselves are producing new generations of extremists, for the moment not aimed outwards, but still it is something that the Central American states must view with some alarm. So the shifts in the architecture, I think, are happening, but they're happening slowly. And Russia isn't really the trend setter in this area. China would be. China is the important player.
Speaking of terrorist group, let me solicit your first-hand inputs. To what extent do you think the Taliban's strategic alliances with terrorist groups like al-Qaeda, combined with escalating threat posed by the ISKP, which is the Islamic State-Khorasan, undermine their legitimacy as a governing entity and exacerbate Afghanistan's internal security challenges?
I think that is a very important question, because the Taliban hasn't changed their tactics of having been an insurgency. And so they're essentially governing as an insurgency. They have maintained a very close relationship with al-Qaeda, with its offshoots like the TTP. They are fighting with ISIS, with ISKP, but not on an ideological level. They are simply fighting to make sure that the Taliban, are the chief insurgent group. That there is very little difference, if any, between what the two groups stand for. So are they legitimate as a governing entity? Absolutely not. That's partly because of their alliance with all these insurgent groups. But it's also because, just like any other insurgency, they are not taking their power from the consent of the people that they control. They have their justification for power, but it doesn't come from below. And so the people who are under their power, I am willing to accept an argument that there are some within Afghanistan who support the Taliban. I think that's probably true. But if the Taliban believes this to be the case, then why don't they allow free press? Why don't they allow any public criticism of what they do? Why don't they allow gatherings of more than a few people? Why don't they allow women to have any kind of public role? Why don't they allow moderate religious leaders to be able to speak out? Why don't they allow people from ethnic groups that are not Pashtun to achieve any kind of stature within the governing coalition? If they actually had legitimacy, they would allow any and all of these actions, because that's what a legitimate government does. So they have basically taken their insurgency and made it national, but they are not a legitimate governing entity. And because they are not, other groups are going to challenge them through force, because they're not allowing any other method of challenge. At this point in time, the Afghan groups that are fighting the Taliban are small and not very impactful. I don't know if that will always be the case, because the longer that this goes on, there are divisions within some of the Taliban fighters. I don't believe in the idea that there are serious divisions among the leaders, but I think there are divisions that are growing among some of the fighters. Some who want to make sure that their own sources of income are going to be guaranteed. There are people being fired from the Ministry of Defense, for example, who may turn against the Taliban. So I think that internal divisions of armed groups are actually something that will happen more and more. And so that will exacerbate the security challenges that Afghanistan faces.
Speaking of Afghanistan's neighborhood, let me bring two countries into perspective. One is Iran and second is Pakistan. To what extent do you think, Iran's construction of a border wall with Kabul, including you have water sharing issues between Iran and Afghanistan's cross-border tensions with Pakistan, how do you think these both reshape the bilateral relations in the context of the larger regional power dynamics?
It's a complex region, as you know better than I do. And so sometimes you have to look at what Afghanistan's choices are and realize that no matter what, and this is the case under the Taliban and is the case under the Republic and other governments, sort of no matter what, one of their neighbors is going to be angry at them. And they have to pick which one. But one by one, there are relationships that need to be taken care of. They cannot survive, I think, as a country with this level of tension and animosity on both sides, from Iran and from Pakistan. I mean, we've already talked about the northern border, which is Tajikistan, basically, and that's something that is being controlled carefully, and there's only a minimal amount of trade that takes place there. So they really need the other borders to be as open as possible, to be as productive as possible. And what's happening is a gradual closing of those two borders. There's the issue of human migration. How many people have tried to get out of Afghanistan and then now are being very cruelly returned in the tens of thousands of people. There are people in Iran who were former soldiers who are being sent back. There are people in Pakistan who are former human rights advocates and judges, and they're being sent back. This is a terrible development. For Afghanistan, on a geopolitical level, it's really important that they work out the water issues with Iran. Excuse me, although Afghanistan has the upper hand when it comes to water, on the larger scale, Iran has the upper hand. They are a far wealthier country, and they have access to the sea. They have a port that Afghanistan needs. So one way or another, this is a very important negotiation that has to happen to create some kind of water sharing arrangement that both sides can live with. With respect to Pakistan, this isn't particularly complicated. Afghanistan has to make a decision about its relationship with Pakistan and the question of hosting and empowering the TTP, doing to Pakistan exactly what Pakistan did to the Republic in Afghanistan. And I think that Taliban is taking half measures. As I understand, they are moving some TTP away from the border. They're trying to get the group to control itself a little bit. But at the end of the day, the whole idea behind the TTP is to threaten the Pakistani state. So as long as the group exists, it is a threat. I don't understand why Pakistan doesn't do more diplomatically. They have diplomatic options that they're not taking. For example, Pakistan could be moving against the Taliban at the United Nations with respect to economic sanctions. They could be arguing for sanctions for the Taliban's support to the TTP, which is very separate from the sanctions against the Taliban that already exist. Pakistan sits on the Security Council this year and next year, and I find it really, really surprising that they're not doing more. And the other thing that both Iran and Pakistan and all of Afghanistan's neighbors could be doing is they could be promoting the voices of Afghans who want to see change, Afghans who are trying to get the Taliban to mitigate its terrible human rights abuses. If Pakistan and Iran helped those voices be stronger in the international community, they would find the Taliban more willing to deal with them and to solve some of their bilateral problems.
Speaking of the next player in the vicinity would be China, what you call the elephant in the room. Please tell us about China's expanding economic and diplomatic influence in Afghanistan, driven by her strategic interests like the Belt and Road Initiative, securing mineral security and effectively countering the security threat posed by the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, ETIM. How do you view these Chinese efforts amid the competing regional interests of various players, including China?
As I mentioned in passing earlier, I think China is honestly the key. That if China has a vision of a neutral, prosperous, and stable Afghanistan, they actually have the tools to make it happen. If China approaches Afghanistan the way they are doing now, I think all that they're trying to do is essentially neutralize any real threats and keep other countries out. When I see China signing, mineral agreements, for example, I honestly don't think it's because they want to conduct mining. China doesn't really need the minerals that are in Afghanistan, which are going to be difficult to get out of the ground anyway. What I think China is doing is just making sure that nobody else gets them. And I think that with respect to the ETIM, they are making sure that the Taliban doesn't empower the group just by holding out the promise of recognition and giving the Taliban some of what it wants as far as international stature. So I think China's got plenty of other things on its mind. They're not thinking that much about Afghanistan, but their tactic and their policy right now is all about keeping Afghanistan from bubbling over, from becoming some kind of problem that's, on their border. As I said, they had a vision of a neutral, peaceful, stable Afghanistan. China could make that happen. I go back to what I mentioned about the need to have an international dialogue with everybody in Afghanistan, which includes people who criticize the Taliban, people who want to see women's rights, and people who want to see a rule of law. That could even include, the business community in Afghanistan, the business community and business interests in China. All of those people should have a vision, and they could make that vision happen. China's power at the United Nations, its influence over Central Asia, its influence over Pakistan, all of that could be used for good, but not what we're seeing right now. So I think their economic and diplomatic influence right now is just, they're just doing what they have to do in order to keep Afghanistan from becoming too unruly. I don't think they're operating with a vision, however.
Clubbing all the economic and security strategies of all the players together, to what degree do you think the competing economic and security strategies of China, Russia, Pakistan, and for that matter, even the US and Afghanistan, ranging from China's the resource-driven Belt and Road investments, China's opportunistic regional posturing, and Pakistan's, it has got its own agenda, and also including the US counterterrorism focus, create divergent priorities? And how do you think this is going to reshape the Kabul's long-term geopolitical trajectory?
Well, at this moment in time, the way that all of those factors are interplaying, and others as well, with respect to the U.S. withdrawal from many areas where it was promoting democratic values, with issues relating to Afghan immigration and migration to Europe. Unfortunately, what's happening with all of these economic and security strategies is that the Taliban is growing more powerful and more entrenched. And I have to say that India is playing a negative role, in my opinion, by becoming close to the Taliban. And they are unapologetic about it. I've spoken with Indian government officials, and they say, well, this is what you have to do. I disagree. I mean, if you have standards and principles of democracy, you should stick to them. But I also disagree that this is in India's interests. Taliban is going to export an extremist view, an extremist ideology to the region. They are training young people, and those young people are going to perpetuate extreme ideal. And at some point, if the Taliban takes official power, for example, takes the seat at the UN for Afghanistan, you will have somebody standing in front of the UN General Assembly at that podium telling extremists around the world to just go harder, to just do more, to repress more, and they will also get their own country. I don't think that's in anybody's interests. And there are times where I think that, China understands that, even Russia understands that they would be empowering an extremist ideology that will hurt them in the longer run. So right now, it's kind of, as the US expression goes, a race to the bottom. People are getting closer to the Taliban as a way of balancing another one of the countries in the region. And it is only serving their interests. I go back to what I said earlier. I don't see a vision of how a country in Afghanistan's unique geographic position can be encouraged to be a neutral, positive and stable nation that links Central and South Asia and East Asia while we're at it, it could be that country. It could be a kind of a key to the whole region. But instead, you have people playing sort of a short-term game that is going to act against their longer-term interests.
Coming to the end of this conversation, my last question is going to be on, we have touched on a lot of areas and perspectives on Afghanistan, but there is something from which we cannot take our eyes off, which is Afghanistan's humanitarian crisis. To what extent do you think the donor fatigue and the strategic dilemma surrounding humanitarian aid allocation to Afghanistan, coupled with inconsistent international accountability efforts, hinder the ability to address Afghanistan's humanitarian crisis?
The country's crisis is affecting humans who didn't ask for this, who don't deserve it, and who should be helped. I believe that. But I also believe that the crisis is manufactured by the Taliban. And therefore, they do have a role to play in alleviating it, and they're not playing that role. Donor nations have been generous in the past, but it's true there is donor fatigue. And part of that fatigue is that there is no end in sight. There's nothing that we can see that is going to happen in Afghanistan to alleviate the problems that we face now. And so humanitarian assistance really can't be forever. At the same time, the government is supposed to be caring about the well-being of its people. This is another reason that I would say the Taliban continues to be an illegitimate group that has seized power, but is not a government. Because if it were a government, they would be contributing to their own people's needs rather than keeping a security force of over 300,000 people in place. What is that security force doing except oppressing the population? Why isn't the money that pays for that security force going to Afghanistan's hospitals? Why is it somehow the responsibility of people around the world to put food on the table rather than the people who are collecting the taxes and customs duties and the benefits of Afghanistan's mineral wealth? I don't understand that, and believe me, nobody in the US government understands that. So the money isn't going to be forthcoming. I think that there is a point where we should respond to the greatest need, where even a country like North Korea can receive food aid when it needs it. But where's the accountability of the Taliban, who feel free to send thugs into marketplaces to arrest girls and do whatever they want to do to those girls in prison? They've got money for that, apparently, but they don't seem to have enough money to buy wheat. So I'll just point out that there is a really, really, really upside down vision of accountability when it comes to Afghanistan's humanitarian crisis. And again, I would put accountability for the well-being of the citizens in the hands of the people who control them, who collect their taxes, who collect their customs revenue, and who sell without legitimacy Afghanistan's natural resources to the highest bidder.
Ma'am, thank you so much. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. A big thank you to our guest, Ms. Annie Pforzheimer, for spending time with us and graciously offering such invaluable first-hand insights. To our audience, I hope you found the discussion insightful and thought-provoking. Thank you for tuning in and being a part of this conversation. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed. Thank you so much, ma'am, for taking time out to be with us and for patiently taking all our questions. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much for continuing to raise these important points.
Thank you.